further ado, George, it is yours to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Mary. It's my pleasure today to introduce Kat Miller. Kat, she's recently retired. She's a master gardener who is now in the process of converting much of her property into pollinator habitat. And she grew up in Cleveland, then moved to Nashville, where she worked as an office manager and followed her passion of becoming a singer-songwriter by night. Area with her husband, 2 stepchildren, 2 rescue dogs, a cat, and 3 chickens, and a yard full of pollination opportunities. So in addition to volunteering with the Cuyahoga County Master Gardeners and the Cuyahoga County Libraries, Kat is a Xerces ambassador representing the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. You'll be hearing about that. And Kat's topic today is Bring Back the Pollinators, Practical Steps for Supporting Native Bees. Welcome to SSAFE, Kat.
Thank you. Thanks very much. All right. So let me go ahead and share my screen. So I've been a Xerces volunteer ambassador since 2020. And for those of you, I'm going to go ahead and advance my screen. For those of you who aren't familiar with Xerces, they are, so they've been around since 1971. They're an international nonprofit that's devoted to protecting the natural world through conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. It's a fantastic organization. Otherwise, I don't think I'd bother spending my time volunteering for them. But anyway, I was very excited when I talked to Michelle about your group, because I feel like I'm going to be preaching to the choir today. As your name, the group's name suggests, you're already very aware of the importance of conservation efforts for pollinators. And I think you probably all would agree with me that it's hard to overstate the importance of pollinators and other invertebrates to the environment. They're the base of the food chain, and everything depends on them. All right. So there are, of course, many insects that can act as pollinators. We have our beetles, our butterflies, our moths, flies, wasps. I think a lot of people don't realize that, flies are important pollinators, that wasps are important pollinators. But of these insect groups, the most important are the bees. And the reason for that is that bees, with the exception of a few wasp species, are the only insects that deliberately collect pollen. So they're collecting pollen and nectar to take back to their nests. And they have often a habit of, they have a behavioral habit called flower constancy, in which they visit the same flowers, the same type of flower, over and over and over again in any one foraging trip. So they have a much greater, they're much more efficient at pollinating flowers than the other types of insects that kind of end up pollinating more or less by accident. All right, so let's see, one type of bee we are not going to talk about here is the honeybees. So you probably know they're not native. They're typically managed as livestock, and they are very important to the agricultural industry, but they're not native, and they're not endangered. I think there's this popular conception that honeybees are endangered, and even though there are a lot of problems in the honeybee industry, honeybees are not an endangered species. So native bees. So we want to talk about native bees. And I am utterly fascinated with native bees. I spend as much time as I can in my garden just observing them. It's to me. They are mostly solitary bees, which are native bees. So because they're not defending a nest or a stash of honey, they're really unlikely to sting. Not to mention the fact that males can't sting anyway. So you only have a 50-50 chance of being in contact with a female bee. And unless they're really provoked, they're not going to sting. Most people don't know that we have almost 3,600 species of native bees in the US and Canada. And in any given garden, even a small garden, there might be 20 or 30 species present. So the thing is, people don't often realize that what they're looking at are bees. There is such amazing diversity among native bee species. So like in this slide, we're looking at the face of the largest bee in North America. It's the common name is a valley carpenter bee, can be up to 1.25 inches long. That's a big bee. And then the smallest species, which is a species of fairy bee called Perdita minima. They're both in California, so I don't know if we have any folks in California on this call, but anyway, but just that's just, you know, the beginning of the diversity of native bee species. They come in an amazing range of colors. So a lot of people might see an insect like this and have no clue that it's a bee, but that is a metallic green sweat bee. So bees can be dull black. They can be bright metallic green or blue. They can have all different colored markings, you know, red, orange, white, yellow. So just overall, it's important to realize that a lot of bees don't look like what we think of as bees. You know, they're not fuzzy, they're not yellow and black striped. They can be really tiny, like this little cuckoo bee. That's a dime in that slide. So just so you have, you know, just for scale. So it's a very small bee. And I know I see a lot of things in my garden where I'm thinking, you know, am I looking at an ant? Am I looking at a fly, or am I looking at a bee? All right, so this amazing range of diversity among native bees. All right, so a little bit about native bees. So some bees, you know, so basically they're all out there collecting pollen and nectar. Some bees have what's called a pollen basket or a corbicula on their hind legs. And that's where they store their pollen as they're gathering it on a foraging trip. Some bees have hairs on their at the underside of their abdomens. That's called a scopa. That's where they collect their pollen as they're out foraging. And then a lot of bees have, as you can see on this slide, this longhorned bee, they have what's called a pollen brush on their hind legs. And that's something that helps them basically move the pollen they're collecting into their corbicula or into their scopa. All right, and oops, sorry, I have to go back. I missed that slide. Okay, so another important part of bee diversity is their tongue length, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly. So some bees, like the bumblebee in this picture, have very long tongues. So they are able to reach down into, you know, deep flowers, you know, that, you know, are funnel shaped to get nectar. But many bees have much shorter tongues. They would not be able to get down into the bottom of this flower. So they need shallow cupped flowers or flat flowers that they're able to collect nectar from. So that's just, that's one important reason why, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, that when we're thinking about the native plants we want to put into our landscapes, we want to consider different shapes. You know, some that are cup shaped, some that are funnel shaped, some that are, you know, maybe a little flatter, a little, you know, more sunflowery. But that's all very important to bee habitat. All right. All right, now we're ready for this. I would like to touch a little bit on the life cycles of solitary bees, because I think it's really fascinating, because they're not social. They don't live in colonies like honeybees. They are, all right. So this is a really simplified slide describing a solitary bee life cycle. But in general, so I'll just kind of give you the generalizations. They live for about a year. So when the female emerges from the nest in the spring or early summer, the first thing she's going to do is mate one time. And then she spends the rest of her life creating and provisioning new nests in which to lay her eggs. So then the nests may have 1 to 10 cells, depending on the bee species. And they're either going to be excavated underground, or she's going to look for a hollow cavity, like a hollow stem. And she's going to, in that hollow stem or underground, she is going to provision a cell by mixing nectar and pollen into a lump that's called bee bread. You can see like on the bottom screen with the larva on there, that's the larva is sitting on a lump of bee bread. She's going to lay her egg on or near the bee bread and then partition that cell off. So she's going to close it off with various different kinds of materials. That's topic for a whole nother talk. She's going to close up that cell and then repeat that process till she's created, 1 to 10 cells in the nest. Then she's going to seal the cell, the entrance of the nest up and leave. Then she's done. She does not rear the young. They're on their own once she's laid the eggs and sealed up the nest. So in, approximately 1 to 3 weeks, species dependent, the egg's going to hatch into this grub-like larva and feed on the bee bread, and then maybe for the next 6 to 8 weeks, and then turn into a pupa. So, and there's different lengths of time for the egg, pupil, a larva and pupil stages for each bee. But the bottom line is that after a year, there will be an adult bee emerging from that nest who's going to go out and mate and repeat the whole process again. So it is a long-term life cycle. So let's talk about what can we do in our landscapes that are going to help our native bees. So the overriding concern is that we want to provide pesticide-free habitat that supports the entire life cycle. So that life cycle that we just did a quick review of. So that's just bottom line key concept. We need to provide pesticide-free habitat that supports the entire life cycle. Okay, so how do we do that? All right, so first of all, roughly 70% of native bee species nest in the ground. They excavate a nest underground. So what they need is bare ground. They need just patches of sandy soil or bare ground into, which they can dig their tunnel. So simply put, we just need to provide them with some space. It could be patchy turf. It doesn't have to be 100% bare. Most species prefer a sandier, loamier soil since it's easier to dig. And if that site gets direct sunlight, that's best case scenario. That helps keeps the nest dry. But anyway, so just having, even as we're going to see, I'm going to switch the slide. Even a small space. This particular slide is a picture of it's a rock. It's a rock in a rock wall that's about 8 inches away from a driveway. And hopefully you can see that underneath that rock, those holes there, those are actually nests that have been dug out by bees. So it doesn't have to be a big space. All right. And then roughly 30% of native bee species nest in tunnels. So this, typically they're going to use the hollow stems left by plants or abandoned beetle holes left in dead trees and stumps, just dead wood of all kinds. So how we can help them is basically keeping instead of removing dead trees, if we can keep them, or even keep parts of them, and don't trim all the dead twigs and branches off of your woody plants. And then if you can leave some pithy stems, so, if you're familiar with like ironweed or, there's lots of other sunflowers, different flowers that end up with like kind of the sturdier stems that will stand up over the winter. If you can leave them standing through the winter and spring, that's really awesome for cavity nesting bees. And then in the spring, what I do and what's recommended by the folks at Xerces and lots of other organizations that I've gotten information from is in the early spring, you can cut those stems down to varying heights, 8 to 24 inches is what's recommended, and thereby creating nesting cavities for bees that will be emerging that season. And the plants will grow up, to cover up those dead stems. So it all works out. It works out great for us and for the bees. All right. So overall, what bees need for the reproductive, aspect of their life cycle are messy areas. A lot of people don't want to hear that because, as gardeners, and I'm not talking your group is exceptional, but many people just want to have a neat, tidy garden. They don't want any messiness. But long grass, just piles of plant debris, dead twigs, old rodent holes, even old birds' nests. Bumblebees will nest in abandoned birds' nests. All of those are critical for our native bees to have, the habitat they need to reproduce. All right. So the next biggie, of course, is food. And we provide food by growing the right kind of flowers. I'm sure you are all aware, at this point that basically native flowers are always the best. Not that there aren't some other, there's cultivated flowers, there's different kinds of garden flowers that it's not like bees can't use them for food, but native flowers have co-evolved with native bee species and other native pollinators. So they have these mutually beneficial relationships that have to do with the size and the color and the shape of the flower and bloom time. So they correspond to different native bee species reproductive cycles, when the adults emerge, what the larvae need to eat, etc. Ideally, pollinator habitat will consist of a diversity of regionally appropriate, that's very important, native plants. And not all flowers, too. It can be shrubs, it can be woody plants, all kinds of other things that are needed. But we're looking for a variety of bloom, colors, shapes, and succession time when the plant is blooming in the ideal native bee habitat. All right, a few other ideas. So one of my favorites is leave the leaves. You probably have all heard that before. Maybe you've seen people with signs. I have listened to many talks and that have really opened my eyes about leaves and the importance of leaving at least some of them on the ground in the fall. They are just crucial habitat, overwintering habitat for not just native bees, but just an mind-blowing array of invertebrates. So anytime you can just kind of pile your leaves up around some trees or into a flower or a vegetable bed and just leave it for the winter, that is a huge step for native pollinators. One thing I was not aware of until recently, because I always used to like to shred my leaves to make mulch for my vegetable garden. And so it's highly recommended that you avoid shredding it at least until, way later in the spring, because as I know now, when you shred your leaves, you're also shredding up all those invertebrates. So that's an important consideration that I have, recently become aware of. All right. Couple other things, building a stick pile, just a simple brush pile. It could be small, it can be big, whatever your space allows, whatever materials you have at hand, pile things up kind of loosely. So there's little crevices and spaces for insects to get in and out. Rodents may make homes in there, and that's fine. Because for instance, like a chipmunk den could be a future bumblebee home. So in fact, it's a preferred bumblebee home. So just making a simple stick pile is an awesome idea, or making a rock pile. and that again could be whatever works for your space. You know, if you just have whatever rocks you have at hand and you can kind of pile up into a messy pile, that's great. If you have could be part of a hardscaping situation, like the beautiful rock wall. But those are important spaces for invertebrate, mostly for cavity nesters within the native bees. And, best case scenario, if you can plant some native, bunch grasses, some kind of shrubby things and flowers around, either a stick pile or a rock pile, that is, that enhances it even more for native wildlife. All right. All right, you can participate in No Mow May. I think you're probably pretty much all familiar with that. It's not the end all and be all, but it does give native bees a head start in the season for their active adult life part of their life cycle. And we can, at the end, if anyone wants to talk a little bit more about these, we certainly can. So I'm just kind of rushing through this. Another thing is signage. Signage has been, people have done studies. It's been shown to be a really effective communication tool, simply because it tells people that your, so-called messiness, or your taller than usual native plants, or whatever it is deliberate. It's not just you neglecting your landscape. And you never know. Some people might, I've had people stop in front of my house and ask me about stuff like that. So you might make a few converts with signage. All right. And then lastly, I want to touch on pesticides. And I have the feeling that you're all, this is probably all a big issue for your group. We're all too aware that pesticides get used frequently. They're ubiquitous in manicured landscapes simply for cosmetic reasons. And this is one of I think if there's anything we can all do and advocate for and work towards, is to stop the cosmetic use of these ubiquitous pesticides, because it kills everything, native, non-native, invertebrate. It's bad for everybody. It's bad for us. So, so that's one thing that, especially for Xerces, that is a big action item for Xerces. The other thing to consider, and a lot of people aren't super aware of this, is, if you're going to plant some pollinator habitat, or, add some native plants to your landscaping, it's really important where those plants are sourced from. So even if you go to a nursery, just because a potted plant has a little tag that says bee friendly or pollinator friendly, don't assume it hasn't been treated with neonicotinoids or other systemic pesticides. My practice is to ask the nursery staff if they can confirm for me that those plants have been raised without systemic insecticides. And if they don't know, if they can't answer that for me, then I won't buy it. I mean, it's just a perfect example of consumer power, and especially if you're able to respectfully let the nursery staff know, well, I'm not going to buy here because I have to know that these were raised without systemic insecticides. But that's one thing to consider if you're going to do any pollinator habitat. All right, so I have to do just a little plug for Xerces. They have an amazing website, xerces.org. And there's all kinds of free information on there, just amazing handouts and fact sheets. They have great regional native plant lists. Their books are fantastic. They're kind of classics in the field. If you could buy, if you're just learning about pollinators, and you could buy one book, I would get the Attracting Native Pollinators book that gets put out by Xerces. It covers so much ground. It's really well organized. It's so informative. Of course, you can get it on their website for a donation, but it's also available like on Amazon and other book selling places. And I am kind of obligated by the organization just to mention that they are a donor supported nonprofit. So if you were ever to check them out and have any interest in they would happily accept a donation. And they really are a great organization. I am very proud to be associated with them. And all right, so that's it. I think I did pretty good on time. So
Yes, thank you.
if anyone has any questions, I am by no means an expert. I'm not a scientist. It's just something that I've spent a lot of time learning about. So if I can answer anything, I'll try.
All right, everyone. Does anyone have questions? Steve has his hand up. And then Warren.
Okay.
I do. This is Susan. I can't get connection. So yes, I have a question.
I can
Oh.
hear you.
You can hear me, good.
Yep.
I have been getting letters for years about Bayer who makes neoniacins, I'll call them. And I'm very aware of all the gardening and the lawn stuff that you recommend because I'm a bird watcher. So, we left brush piles and snag trees and all kinds of things. But my question is, has Bayer or any other manufacturer done anything about stopping the production of neocins?
Not that I'm aware of. And in fact, what's happened, recently, because there is this kind of pushback against the neonics, and so they're developing new systemic insecticides that are just as bad. So they can, then a nursery can use these new products and say, oh no, we don't use Roundup or whatever. So
well, I'm thinking, it's National Resources Defense Council and also, or maybe Friends of the Earth that put these petitions out to Bayer. But this has been going on for a decade that I've been getting them. And so obviously nothing's being done. And I'm very frustrated on another point because I have this wonderful blown up photograph of a spice bush, swallowtail butterfly caterpillar who is very charming. He's very large scale on a leaf. And I'm sorry I can't show it to you because it's kind of comic. Call him Walleye Willie. His eyes are kind of going out to the side.
Thank you, Susan. We have so many hands up. I'm gonna progress to the next one, but thank you so much for your input. It's good to hear from you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Steve Woodbury, then Warren, and then we'll progress through the other hands.
Okay, a couple of questions that have come up at Collington. I noticed you used the no cosmetic use of pesticides. We have stopped using herbicides on our lawn areas, which is a start, and we're really discussing what else. We're trying also to deal with a number of invasive exotic plants, which are crowding out native plants, and discussing, what about the use of herbicides, selectively and topically to get rid of the invasive plants, which don't feed the natives.
Right.
Second question, I'll just get it out. And second question is, we are leaving more areas unmowed in meadows that are mowed once a year, but they grow up to tall grasses and all kinds of things and milkweed, and have assumed that mowing in the spring is the best time. And I'm wondering if there's guidance on what time in the spring is best for mowing in a once a year area in meadows.
So average at least 50 degrees Fahrenheit, over a week or 2 weeks. That's when a lot of the invertebrates are start emerging from their winter nest sites. I think, and I have heard some information about this. I would probably try to consult like the Xerces website. Because there are, people have done a lot of research on this, and I don't think I recall all the detail about it. I know that if you're like leaving a large area unmowed, sometimes they'll recommend just mow parts of it at different times. So depending on if it's just a small patch, then that's one thing. If it's a big area, like they do like a third, like mow 1/3 of it at one time of year, mow the another third at another time of year, and in the last one at another time of year, just to give the insects a chance to still use that habitat. As far as the pesticides, in a 15-minute time frame, we could really talk a long time about pesticides, and that is definitely problematic, trying to get rid of invasives. So I think that what Xerces recommends and what I've heard from many different sources is there are no good ways to get rid of a lot of our invasives. So sometimes a very using a pesticide, an herbicide in a very kind of spot using it. So if you can just hit those particular plants, and just try your best not to let that herbicide get on any of the surrounding vegetation. Sometimes there aren't a lot of other options. So like Xerces basically says, if you do need to use them, just use them as little as possible in as few places as possible and as carefully as possible. So, and I know I run into that same issue myself. It's like,
thanks. I know there are a bunch of other questions, but appreciate that.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Kat, slightly shorter answers because we're getting a little bit tight on time.
Okay.
All right, Warren, and then Penelope.
We have thank you. We have a southern magnolia outside my window, and they have large petals about the size of your palm, and they drop the pistils in there, or the stamens in there. And I've seen at least 3 kinds of bees just reveling in the pistils. It's quite amazing to watch. They're obviously, it's sort of like bee nip or something. Fascinating to see them.
Yeah.
Wonderful. How fun. All right, Penelope, you are muted, so I'm going to ask you to unmute. Just click that button that you see.
When you mentioned that bees need bare ground, I hope that was an argument against all these great quantities of mulch that show up every spring.
Yes. Yes,
Good.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, mulch is, especially that the mulch where they use artificial coloring and everything to color the bark. Yeah, that's not good. So yes. In a word.
All right, last question, Merle Tanis.
Yes, Kat, thank you. This program is just absolutely wonderful. I have a question about bee houses. We had some very enthusiastic residents at our Earth Day celebration in April, building numerous bee houses, and we're really pleased, using small diameter bamboo and so forth. Mm-hmm. And I was just wondering if you recommend putting these out, how much are they used versus some of these obviously native habitats?
Right. So, the native habitats I think are always best. Sure. But I have, and I don't, in fact, I want to ask my husband to build me one of those. I have not used any of those bee houses before, heretofore, but I know people who've gotten lots of insects nesting in them. And I think the main consideration with those is they can't you know, they're only good for a season or two. What you don't want to do is just leave them out there indefinitely, because, you know, viruses accumulate, you know, stuff that attracts mold and whatever. So, you know, a season or two and replace it. Or sometimes like they sell ones where you can actually, you know, you can replace the, you know, those hollow pieces and use the rest of the structure. But I would, you know, I'm going to try one. So
well, we had lots of, like I said, lots of enthusiasm to me, just to even connect people with the concept of the bees needing habitat and so on. I think it carries a lot of weight that way too.
It does. And as long as people don't think that that's like a substitute for habitat, it's an enhancement to habitat. That's my take on it. Yeah.
That's a super question. Wow, thank you so much, Kat. I recorded this presentation and I know there's going to be high demand for it. It's so interesting and I learned so much myself. So feel free to stay on or hop off, but we're going to move on to our next agenda items.
All right, well, thanks. It's been my pleasure.